I don't just talk about other people's stuff, I also make my own. Books in particular. To date, I have 4 books you can check out on Amazon. Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and the short story collection Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Hop on down to the description for Amazon links to all 4 books. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni viewer, and I'm taking a break between editing Halloween videos to discuss something not Halloween specific. Recently, I managed to pick up a copy of The Trials of Ultraman, which is the second collected volume of Marvel's Ultraman series, which began with The Rise of Ultraman. Now, if you've been with the channel for long enough, you may recall that I did a little unscripted review kind of like this of the first volume, The Rise of Ultraman, and I was on the fence about it. There were a lot of things the book did that I felt were maybe not necessarily the best choices, or at least felt like kind of weird choices that I wasn't too sure about yet, depending on where they wound up going. Like having the Science Patrol essentially be S.H.I.E.L.D. 2.0, where it's a shifty, secret organization that you're never quite sure if you can fully trust or not. Or things like having the monsters all have one origin as opposed to a variety of origins, which in a few ways made it kind of feel like the story was just kind of taking its main premise from Pacific Rim. Not that Pacific Rim is bad, but, Pacific Rim is not Ultraman. But at the same time, I felt like the portrayal of the central character was interesting. Because, first of all, it gave Shin Hayata more of a personality than he ever had in the original series. I mean, I like the original Ultraman, but let's be honest, Hayata was kind of the least interesting character in that whole show. He was basically just there as an anchor for Ultraman. In the Marvel comic, though, we get to see him a bit more. He's portrayed as sort of a rambunctious rebel with a cause, if you will. Someone who's not necessarily going to follow the rules, but who is not out for himself. He's trying to do well. And of course, the Ultra himself is depicted as a good being. Alien, certainly, not necessarily familiar with human customs or human emotions, but still a being of light who is benevolent and just embodies everything good. And it was that made me think, okay, maybe the series does get what Ultraman is about. Because if they got that right, and Ultraman is the title character after all, maybe everything else will fall into place going forward. Having read The Trials of Ultraman, I'm not so sure that's gonna happen. I'm sorry to say I'm not really impressed with how Marvel has been doing Ultraman as a whole. And I do have my reasons for thinking that. Part of the issue is that the comic feels inefficient. By that I mean, okay, let me back up just a little bit. Some channels that have been talking about comics recently have brought up the subject of whether or not there are too many dialogue sequences in modern comics. Whether there's just too much dialogue in general, or scenes that have too much dialogue in them. And it's not necessarily because they don't want to read and just want to look at the pretty pictures. As I see it, it's a matter of efficiency. Comics are a medium that's driven by words, yes, but it's also equally driven by visuals. Comics is a visual medium, let's be honest. The thing is, though, in the past, comics have been able to balance words and visuals. So it's never necessarily been that big of a problem before. And sometimes there were comics that were wordier than others, and comics that were more visual than others. But in general, there's been more of this sense that people are noticing that comics have a lot of people talking and not a lot of doing, not a lot of action, if you will. And again, it's not about the whole, I can't bear to have words going through my head. I want just to see big action sequences. No, it's about how, in Trials of Ultraman at least, it's about how there's so much talking that it's breaking the rule of show, don't tell. In Trials of Ultraman, for example, like early on, there are sequences where it's just characters talking and talking and talking, a lot of which is about stuff that happened between issues. Stuff like the reformation of the Science Patrol and the adopting of the orange uniforms as opposed to the gray ones, and how secrets are slowly being disseminated, and all this sort of thing that we could have gotten visual accompaniment for, even if it was just a montage, but instead it's just a whole bunch of people talking, and some of it is stuff we already know. And it feels inefficient. It feels like the comic is just so obsessed with being wordy that it's not really it's not moving forward. Imagine if this were an episode of the series proper. You would have two characters essentially standing in a room, going back and forth, talking to each other nonstop, and the scene, I think, would eventually start to drag a little. And again, there are comics that make heavy use of dialogue, it's true, but past comics have found ways to do things like incorporating the dialogue with the action, having the characters actually doing stuff as they are talking. So that doesn't really happen a whole lot in this book. And when we do get to the actual action sequences, well, that's an issue unto itself. One of the other ways in which the Ultraman comics feel inefficient is that they don't really seem to know how to properly pace certain stories. Like the original Ultraman series, which, that's what this comic is based on, it had a certain sense of urgency to it. Not like it was in a rush to get to the end, but it knew it had to fit everything within a particular time frame, and maybe it wasn't perfect right out of the gate, but by the end, they were certainly very proficient at telling those complete stories within the allotted time. Now, in the comics aren't necessarily in a rush to get everything done right away, but at the same time, it feels like they're cramming stuff in. Let me explain. In terms of not being in a rush, I mean, you know how in the original Ultraman series, the very first episode, like the last 10 minutes, we saw Hayata merge with Ultraman, Ultraman make his grand debut, and Ultraman fights Bemular. That was the finale of that episode, and from there, the premise is set, everyone is on the same page, the series just progresses from there. In the comics, it takes like 3 issues for Hayata and Ultraman to meet and merge and make their grand debut, and they don't fight Bemular until the final issue. That's really dragging it out. And I guess you could say they were kind of going on the idea of what if this were a movie, like what you see in the MCU, or we've seen so many superhero origin movies at this point where the character is established before he first suits up, if you will. But at the same time, like, you're looking at a matter of efficiency here. The first issue is supposed to really hook the audience in, much like a first episode is supposed to do. And the first issue of The Rise of Ultraman doesn't even have the main premise of the series happen. It's got the main premise in terms of world that's full of kaiju and people are trying to stop it, but it's Ultraman, not Ultra Q, Ultraman. Ultraman should be the focus, and Hayata should be the focus. And the comic ends before we even get to see what comes of that. And as the series progresses, we get a lot of stuff that's not devoted to action or fighting kaiju or anything. Ideally, these scenes would be used for character development, and sometimes they are. Like, for example, we have a sequence where Hayata is with his father, something that wasn't even vaguely hinted at in the original TV series. As far as we knew, nobody in the Science Patrol had a family life. So, this is an interesting start, certainly, though I'll touch a bit more on that, how it actually plays out in a moment. A lot of the time, though, these scenes are devoted to just exposition. Lots and lots of exposition. And yes, exposition has always been part of the Ultra series. But again, it's the way it plays out here. It feels like the exposition takes up more time than the character development. And since we are getting the character development and we're having more of that introduced than we would have had in the original TV show, the fact that we're getting more exposition and less character development makes the exposition stand out even more. The character development should be the focus if we're going to have these scenes where the characters are not engaged in fighting monsters. Though even the character development isn't necessarily that great. I said I'd touch on how Hayata interacts with his father. May as well do that now. Now, the idea is that Hayata and his father are somewhat estranged. They've never had a good relationship from the looks of it. Or maybe they did at some point, but there's a particular event that happened which drove them apart, even though they're still in each other's lives. And no matter what Hayata does, his father is always disapproving of him. Interestingly, Hayata reveals that he is Ultraman to his father, and his father also, once again, immediately disapproves. I mean, I know that culturally speaking, Asian parents tend to be incredibly strict and hard to please, but again, it's the way this whole thing plays out. The scene where Hayata and his father interact is split between two issues. The end of one issue and the beginning of the next. However, if the scene itself were to play out in like a TV series, it would just take a couple of minutes. And the progress is basically the father saying, "I disapprove of everything you do, Hayata, and you will never be enough for me." To which Hayata says, "But I'm Ultraman. I'm the hero that saves the world." "Really? Hang on a minute. I have to take this phone call." "Okay, phone call's over. Now, what are your thoughts on me being Ultraman?" "You don't deserve that power, and I'm still disappointed in you because that's perpetually who I am." "Well, screw you too, Dad. I'm leaving." That's basically what it amounts to. There's not even really a moment of shock for the father to actually let it sink in that his son has merged with an alien being. He just instantly goes right to, "Nope, still hate you." And as the books progress, we see that his father is so against Hayata that he actually starts doing stuff to try sabotaging the poor kid. And, yeah, even in context, I think that's a little extreme. And we do get an explanation for why they're estranged, which again comes as just another sort of info dump in a way. But I don't know, it just doesn't feel like it progressed that well, which I guess kind of also comes to the point about having to cram stuff in. So it needs to have the character development and it needs to establish these relationships, but it also has to fit everything within these issues. And even though the issues go one into the other, it's not an episodic series, they still feel like they've got to go through it as quickly as possible, which is again not very efficient, but it also affects the monsters. A large part of the Ultra series appeal is the fact that it's a kaiju series. So the kaiju are a big part of the draw. The kaiju most of the time are actually in the series more than the Ultras are, because they're the primary threat. They're the thing everyone has to be dealing with. And so far in these books, they're barely focused on at all. From the looks of it, Marvel basically has access to everything from the Ultra series. At least the original Ultraman, and probably stuff from Ultra 7 as well. So that means every Ultra and every Kaiju. And given that the original series would run for about 50 to 53 episodes each, and there was usually one monster per episode, that's like 50 monsters per series, taking into account two-parters or episodes where multiple monsters showed up. That is a lot, I realize, and I'm not going to hold the people making this comic over the fire and demand that they feature all of them immediately, or that they even have to feature all of them, period. Obviously, some monsters are going to be more popular than others, so sure, focus on the more popular ones. I'm okay with that. Or even just the personal favorites of the people making them. Whatever. You don't have to include them all, is what I'm saying. However, if you're going to include them, I feel like the least you could do is actually spotlight them. There are 10 individual issues of the Ultraman's comics so far, 5 for Rise and 5 for Trials. Only 3 kaiju have truly been spotlighted: Zumbolar, Jiras, and Bemular. That's it. Maybe Naranga could count as a 4th, because he's the first monster that Ultraman technically goes up against in Rise of Ultraman. But even then, Naranga is treated more like the other kaiju, which is he's just a monster that shows up and needs to be put down. And how quickly those monsters show up and get put down can vary. Sometimes the fights happen at the end of a book. Sometimes they happen in the middle of a book. Sometimes, bafflingly, they happen at the beginning of a book. And that means nothing else action-oriented happens after that. Which kind of feels like telling a joke by starting with the punchline, or choreographing a dance number and putting your most impressive trick at the beginning. It just doesn't feel like they really know what to do. The monster fights in a way feel like an afterthought. And again, what do we get in their place? A bunch of scenes where people are standing around delivering exposition. What's more, some of the monsters that are getting sidelined so far are actually popular ones. In Trials of Ultraman, Gomorrah gets his first big fight. He appeared for like one panel in Rise of Ultraman, just in the background basically. But he actually gets to fight Ultraman in Trials. Well, theoretically at least. The way in which that particular fight is framed is interesting, because it's like people filming a video that was posted to YouTube while it was happening, and it's from their perspective, so we see them get saved by Ultraman, but as a result, we only get a few fleeting glimpses of Gomorrah. That is technically his comic debut, and Gomorrah is one of the most popular Ultra monsters. He was the first monster to give an Ultra an actual hard time in a fight. First two-parter of Ultraman. He managed to actually fight Ultraman to a draw. And Gomorrah has proven so popular, he's not even considered a villain anymore. These days, he actually is one of the good guys who fights alongside the Ultras. That's how popular he is. He's so popular, he went from villain to hero. So he's this really popular figure in the series, and his debut fight results in just a few fleeting glimpses of him before he disappears? That's it? As a fan of Gomorrah, I'm kinda let down by that. It gets even worse because sometimes monsters are featured on the covers who have yet to appear in the series at all. Be they main covers or variant covers, we've seen Zeton, Balton, Red King, a bunch of different others, not all of whom are actually in those issues or in the series at all. I mean, talk about your false advertising. Marvel has done this before, though. It's something that's known as Wolverine advertising. Back when Wolverine was Marvel's most popular hero, they made a habit of putting him on the covers of different issues of different series that he was not in. But they figured if people saw Wolverine on the cover, they would buy those issues thinking Wolverine was in it, only to be duped. But what does Marvel care? They got the money anyway. So I'm kind of shocked to see them doing that again. I mean, really, I am. You know, a part of me wonders if the reason for some of these issues is the fact that the book is telling an ongoing story. that it's not just episodic, one story for one issue. Or even if they did want to do the ongoing story throughout, there is precedent in the Ultra series for having an ongoing plot, but still having a self-contained episode where a monster shows up and is dealt with before the credits roll. Maybe the book could benefit from adopting that format a bit more. Because right now it's not, and I don't really think it's working. And then we get to the end of Trials of Ultraman. And this is technically a spoiler, but I gotta talk about it. So, Dan Moriboshi, the alter ego of Ultra 7, showed up at the end of Rise of Ultraman, and he's brought back to the Science Patrol in Trials of Ultraman. And there's this big mystery over where he's been, because he disappeared back in the 60s in this timeline, supposedly when encountering Ultra 7, and nobody's sure where he's been, how he got back, what happened to Ultra 7. But we do know from his interaction with Hayata that he is yet again another person who's saying, don't trust the Science Patrol. Even he doesn't trust them. Nobody trusts them. There's a lot of mistrust in this book that just was not present in any other version of the Ultra series that I've seen so far. But anyway, the Trials of Ultraman ends with Dan Moriboshi going up to Shin Hayata and saying, if there was any other way, I would do it, but there's no other way, so I'm sorry. And then all of a sudden, he drains all the Ultra energy out of Hayata while morphing into Ultra 7. To be continued. I don't think I like that twist. I mean, yes, I realize we don't know what's going on. We don't have the full context, and it's probably going to be explained in the mystery of Ultra 7. But just right now, this twist feels like it came out of nowhere. I'm not even basing it on the fact that I just can't imagine the original characters doing that. Though, to be clear, I can't picture it. I just cannot picture the Ultra 7 from the series doing that to the Ultraman of the series. Maybe I could picture Ultraman Agul doing that to Ultraman Gaia, but those are different characters in a completely different setting. But that's not even the main reason I don't like this twist. Based on what the book itself establishes, this still comes out of nowhere. We are told in the first issues that the Ultras are completely good beings. They are completely enlightened. They are not evil. They do not harm the innocent. The only time they are violent is towards monsters. And on top of that, Ultraman keeps insisting to Hayata that Ultra 7, his brother, would never cause any harm. He would not hurt a human. He is not evil. He is not dangerous. And up to this point, we've seen no reason to think that Ultraman would have any reason to lie about anything, least of all his own people and his own brother. Then all of a sudden, Dan, who is apparently merged with Ultra 7, much like Hayata is merged with Ultraman, does this. An act that certainly does seem harmful and downright villainous. It just goes against what we've established in this book. Again, I realize that they're probably going to provide an explanation, but let me tell you, it has to be the best explanation possible, because right now it feels like a twist simply for its own sake. Something to shock the reader to make them wonder what could possibly be going on. And as much as I'd like to think that there will be a great explanation, I'm skeptical, because everything else about this book just hasn't been doing it for me. I wish it had. I'm trying to like it, I really am, but the way in which these books are executed just isn't working so far. And I'm kind of starting to wonder how the people at Super Ryan Productions feel about this, because, recently they released a statement about how they're not going to farm Ultraman out to any American companies, although they said that after this deal was made, so they maybe mean any other American companies, particularly Hollywood studios, because they don't want Ultraman to lose that which is part of his Japanese identity. Read between the lines, and you can figure that they're probably saying in a very diplomatic way, we don't want to make Ultraman woke, which I respect completely. But at the same time, all this stuff is going on in the Marvel comics, and they've got to sign off on it, right? It just doesn't feel like this is the sort of thing they would sign off on. I don't know. I'll probably give the Mystery of Ultra 7 a chance, but if that just continues the trend that these books are currently on, I'm probably not going to keep following it. I'm really enjoying the original Ultra series. I've been picking up new series as they've been imported. I'm really liking them. I do have a good sense of what makes a good Ultra series at this point. And I just don't think that's being captured by Marvel. I wish I could say otherwise, but at the moment, I'm just not feeling it. That's just where I stand. I'm sure you guys have your own thoughts, so feel free to share them if you want. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.
Congratulations, you reached the end. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to consider supporting us on Patreon. Of course, the other way to support us is to go to Amazon and check out our books: Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Also check the description for links to DeviantArt and other platforms we operate. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.